courtroom is packed. People sit in rows, whispering among themselves. Some glance at the clock, waiting for the trial to begin. Lawyers shuffle their papers, preparing their arguments. At the front, the judge's chair stands empty. The sound of footsteps echoes through the room. A bailiff clears his throat, signaling everyone to settle down. The doors swing open. A man walks in. He is tall, well-dressed, and confident. His black suit is sharp. His briefcase is firm in his grip. His eyes scan the room with quiet focus. His name is David Carter. He is a lawyer. A good one. David moves with purpose. He steps past the crowd and heads toward the defense table. His client sits there looking nervous. David nods at him, offering silent reassurance. People in the courtroom notice him. Some exchange looks. Others frown. A few whisper under their breath. A bailiff watches David closely. His face is stiff. He takes a step forward. "Sir, this area is for legal professionals only," the bailiff says. His voice is firm. David stops, surprised. He adjusts his grip on his briefcase. "I know," he replies calmly. The bailiff narrows his eyes. "Then why are you here?" David tilts his head slightly. "I'm the defense attorney," he says, his voice steady. The bailiff stares at him. His lips press into a thin line. "Do you have permission to be here?" David lets out a small breath. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out his bar ID. He holds it up for the bailiff to see. The bailiff barely looks at it. "I need you to step outside, sir." A few people in the courtroom chuckle. The prosecutor smirks from his seat. David keeps his posture straight. "I don't think you understand," he says. "I am the lawyer representing the defendant." The bailiff folds his arms. "You need to leave, sir. Now." David doesn't move. His grip tightens on his briefcase. His face remains calm, but his jaw clenches slightly. Murmurs grow in the courtroom. Some people lean forward watching. The prosecutor glances at the judge's empty seat, waiting. David turns his head slightly. He notices the court clerk watching the exchange. The clerk looks uncomfortable, but stays quiet. David takes a slow breath. "I am not leaving," he says, keeping his voice level. "I have every right to be here." The bailiff's face hardens. He gestures to another guard. The second officer steps closer. The mood in the courtroom shifts. The quiet whispers turn into nervous muttering. David stands firm. He doesn't back down. He doesn't raise his voice. He simply waits. The judge has not arrived yet, but when they do, David intends to make sure this never happens again. The courtroom remains tense. The bailiff stands firm, blocking David's path. The second officer watches closely, waiting for a signal. David doesn't move. His face stays calm, but his eyes sharpen. He adjusts his tie, steadying himself. "I need you to leave, sir," the bailiff repeats, his voice louder this time. David exhales slowly. "I already told you," he says. "I am the defense attorney for this case." The bailiff crosses his arms. "I don't care who you say you are. You don't belong here." David holds up his bar ID again. "This is my proof." The bailiff doesn't look at it. He waves a hand dismissively. "Anyone can print a badge," he scoffs. A few people in the courtroom chuckle. The prosecutor smirks at the exchange, shaking his head. David clenches his jaw but keeps his composure. "If you have any doubts," he says, "check with the court clerk." The clerk, still seated at the side, glances nervously between David and the bailiff. She shifts uncomfortably, unsure whether to speak. The bailiff lets out a small laugh. "I don't need to check with anyone," he says. "I make the calls here." David raises an eyebrow. "You make the calls, not the judge?" The bailiff's smile fades. His expression hardens. "That's it," he snaps. "I won't ask again. Leave now, or I'll remove you myself." David doesn't budge. His grip on his briefcase tightens. His client watches from the defense table, wide-eyed. David finally speaks, his voice lower but firm. "If you put your hands on me," he warns, "you will regret it." The room goes silent. The bailiff hesitates for the first time. The second officer shifts uncomfortably, unsure if he should intervene. The judge's chair remains empty. The prosecutor leans back in his seat, arms crossed. His smirk is gone, but amusement still lingers in his eyes. David stays rooted in place. "I will not be bullied out of my own courtroom," he says. The bailiff scoffs. "Your courtroom?" David meets his stare. "Yes," he says, "because as long as I'm the attorney on record, this is my case, and I will defend my client." The courtroom murmurs. Some people nod, others exchange skeptical glances. The bailiff's jaw tightens. "I've had enough of this." He lifts his radio, ready to call for backup. David steps forward, just an inch. Before you make that call, he says, ask yourself one thing. The bailiff pauses. Are you really prepared for the consequences? The bailiff's grip on the radio falters. His confidence wavers just slightly. David doesn't break eye contact. Because when the judge walks in, he continues, and sees you trying to remove a licensed attorney from this courtroom, he lets the sentence hang in the air. The bailiff shifts on his feet. He glances toward the courtroom doors, hoping the judge will arrive soon and break the tension, but the judge is still nowhere to be seen. David straightens his posture. I'm going to my seat now, he says, unless you'd like to try stopping me again. The second officer takes a step back. He doesn't want to get involved. The bailiff clenches his fists, but doesn't move. David walks past him, slow and steady. The murmurs in the courtroom grow. He reaches the defense table and sets his briefcase down. He takes his seat. The prosecutor's smirk is gone. The bailiff exhales sharply and walks away, frustrated. David exhales quietly. This fight isn't over, but for now, he has won this round. The tension in the courtroom lingers. People whisper, glancing at David. Some still look doubtful. Others seem impressed. The bailiff stands near the door, arms crossed. His face is stiff with frustration. He watches David like a hawk. David ignores him. He focuses on his client, who looks nervous. You okay? He asks in a calm tone. His client nods slowly. Yeah, but that was crazy. David gives a small smile. It's nothing I haven't dealt with before. Before his client can respond, the courtroom doors swing open. The judge walks in. All rise, the court clerk announces. Everyone stands. The judge takes their seat, adjusting their glasses. They glance at the papers in front of them, then at the room. You may be seated. Chairs scrape against the floor as everyone sits. The judge clears their throat. We are here today for the case of... They stop suddenly, their eyes narrowing. Their gaze lands on David. David straightens his posture, waiting. The judge glances at the prosecutor, then at the bailiff. Who is this? They ask, pointing at David. David's stomach tightens. He expected this, but it still stings. The bailiff smirks. That's what I was trying to tell you, Your Honor. This man walked in here claiming to be a lawyer. A few quiet laughs ripple through the room. The prosecutor chuckles under his breath. David clenches his jaw. The judge frowns, looking at him. Sir, are you an attorney for this case? David reaches for his briefcase. Yes, Your Honor, he says firmly. He pulls out his documents and holds them up. The judge doesn't take them right away. Instead, they lean back in their chair. Bailiff, did you check his credentials? The bailiff shrugs. He showed some kind of ID, but I didn't verify it. David's grip tightens on the papers. His voice remains calm. If you had, this situation could have been avoided. The judge sighs. Bring his documents here. The courtroom watches as David stands, steps forward, and hands his papers to the court clerk. The clerk walks them over to the judge. Silence fills the room as the judge scans the documents. Their expression shifts. The murmurs in the room grow louder. The judge looks up, clearing their throat. It appears there's been a mistake. The prosecutor leans forward. Mistake, Your Honor? The judge exhales. Mr. Carter is indeed the defense attorney on record. A hush falls over the courtroom. The bailiff's face turns pale. The prosecutor shifts uncomfortably. David stays silent, letting the truth settle in. The judge sets the documents down and fixes their gaze on the bailiff. Did you try to remove an attorney from this courtroom? The bailiff stammers. I thought... The judge's voice turns sharp. Did you verify his identity? The bailiff's face reddens. No, Your Honor. The judge shakes their head. I expect better judgment from my officers. David watches, emotionless. He could say something. He could push further, but he doesn't. The judge sighs and turns back to the case. Let's proceed. David takes his seat again. His client whispers, that was wild. David nods slightly. He knows this fight isn't over. Respect isn't given, it has to be taken. The courtroom remains quiet. The judge adjusts their glasses, scanning the papers in front of them. The prosecutor sits stiffly, clearly uncomfortable. David keeps his posture straight, his face unreadable. The bailiff stands awkwardly near the door, shifting on his feet. The judge clears their throat. Let's move forward. Is the defense ready? David nods. Yes, Your Honor. The prosecutor hesitates, then speaks. Before we begin, I request a brief recess. The judge frowns. Recess? We haven't even started. The prosecutor glances at David, then back at the judge. I just need a few minutes to organize my case. David knows exactly what's happening. The prosecutor underestimated him. He thought David wouldn't make it this far. Now he needs time to adjust. The judge sighs. Fine. 10 minutes. They bang the gavel. Court is in recess. People start murmuring. The prosecutor quickly gathers his files and walks toward the hallway. The bailiff follows, avoiding David's eyes. David stays seated. His client leans in. What was that about? David chuckles quietly. He needs time to rethink his strategy. His client raises an eyebrow. Why? You just got here. David clasps his hands together. Exactly. David stands and walks toward the hallway. He hears whispers as he moves past the crowd. Some people watch him with curiosity, others still look doubtful. Near the exit, the prosecutor is speaking to a group of legal assistants. His voice is low, but David catches bits of it. This wasn't supposed to happen. David smirks to himself but keeps walking. Just as he steps into the hallway, he hears someone call his name. Mr. Carter. David turns around. The judge stands a few feet away. Their expression is unreadable. Yes, Your Honor, David responds respectfully. The judge studies him for a moment. How long have you been practicing law? David tilts his head slightly. 10 years. The judge nods slowly. Impressive. David doesn't respond. He knows there's more. The judge hesitates. Then they sigh. I apologize for earlier. David's eyes remain steady. I understand. The judge looks away briefly as if choosing their next words carefully. I don't like distractions in my courtroom, they finally say. David doesn't miss the meaning behind those words. Neither do I. The judge meets his gaze, then gives a small nod. See you inside. They turn and walk away. David exhales quietly. He knows what just happened. The judge wasn't just apologizing. They were acknowledging him, not as an outsider, not as a problem, as a lawyer. The 10-minute recess ends. The courtroom fills up again. The prosecutor returns, looking more serious now. The bailiff keeps his distance from David. The judge takes their seat. Let's proceed. David straightens his tie and prepares to speak. This time, there is no doubt who he is. The courtroom is silent. The judge looks toward the prosecutor. You may proceed, they say. The prosecutor stands, adjusting his tie. His confidence from earlier is gone. He clears his throat and begins his opening statement. David listens carefully. He studies the prosecutor's body language. His opponent is nervous, uncertain. The prosecutor lays out his argument, trying to sound confident, but there's hesitation in his voice. He knows David is a real threat now. When the prosecutor finishes, the judge nods. Mr. Carter, your turn. David stands slowly. He buttons his suit jacket, then steps forward. He places his hands on the table and looks around the room. I will make this simple, he says. His voice is clear, steady. The evidence will show that my client is innocent. Murmurs ripple through the courtroom. The judge raises a hand and the room quiets. David picks up a folder. He walks toward the judge and hands it to the clerk. In this file, you'll find records that prove my client was not at the scene. The prosecutor leans forward, trying to see what's inside. The judge flips through the papers, their expression unreadable. David turns back to the courtroom. Despite this evidence, my client was arrested based on assumptions. No proper investigation was done. He lets that statement sit in the air. The prosecutor shifts uncomfortably. The bailiff looks at the floor. David continues. This is not just about my client. This is about how we see justice, about who we assume is guilty before we even look at the facts. His voice is calm, but the weight of his words is heavy. The judge exhales and looks at the prosecutor. Do you have a response? The prosecutor hesitates. I need time to review this new evidence. The judge frowns. You should have reviewed it before we started. David remains quiet, watching. The prosecutor flips through the file, his expression tense. He knows he's losing control of the case. After a long pause, the judge looks at David. We will take a short recess. The gavel bangs. The courtroom empties. David walks to his client, who looks stunned. What just happened? The client asks. David smiles slightly. The truth is coming out. His client exhales. I thought they were never going to listen. David's smile fades. They had no choice. When you present the truth clearly, people can't ignore it. The prosecutor walks past them, still flipping through the documents. His face is pale. David watches him go. The case is shifting, and this time, the system is forced to see the facts. The courtroom doors open again. People file back inside, whispering among themselves. The energy in the room is different now. David walks in slowly, his expression calm. His client follows, looking hopeful for the first time. The judge takes their seat. They adjust their glasses and glance at the prosecutor. Have you reviewed the new evidence? The prosecutor clears his throat. His confidence from earlier is gone. Yes, Your Honor. The judge nods. And? The prosecutor hesitates. He shifts in his seat, tapping his fingers against the table. It does raise concerns about the original arrest. A few gasps ripple through the courtroom. The prosecutor, who had been so sure of himself before, is now on shaky ground. David watches him carefully. He isn't celebrating yet. He knows the fight isn't over. The judge folds their hands. Mr. Carter, do you believe your client was unfairly targeted? David stands, his posture straight. Yes, Your Honor. The judge turns back to the prosecutor. Then tell me, why was this evidence overlooked? The prosecutor shifts again. We relied on witness statements at the time. David steps forward. Witnesses who made assumptions, witnesses who had no proof. The prosecutor doesn't respond. David continues. And when my client was brought in, was he given a fair chance to explain himself? Silence. The judge exhales. It appears mistakes were made in this case. David knows that's as close as the system will get to admitting it. The prosecutor lowers his head. The judge sighs. We will reconvene tomorrow. I expect to hear a revised position from the prosecution. They bang the gavel. Court is adjourned. The courtroom erupts in murmurs. The prosecutor gathers his papers quickly and rushes out. The bailiff, who had once been so sure of himself, avoids David's eyes as he exits. David turns to his client. It's not over, but we have them cornered. His client lets out a shaky laugh. I never thought I'd see this happen. David places a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You deserved this from the start. As they leave the courtroom, people whisper. Some watch David with newfound respect, others look ashamed, but David doesn't pay attention to any of it. He walks out, steady and strong. He came here for justice, and he's not leaving without it. David walks out of the courtroom, his client by his side. The air feels lighter, but the weight of the moment still lingers. People whisper as they pass. Some avoid eye contact, others look at David with newfound respect. The prosecutor exits quickly, his face unreadable. The bailiff stands near the door, his posture tense. He doesn't say a word. David doesn't stop, he keeps walking. His focus is on his client. Outside, the client finally speaks. I can't believe it, he says, shaking his head. I really thought they were going to ignore everything. David smiles slightly. They tried. The client exhales. I don't know how you stayed so calm in there. David stops walking. He turns to his client. Because I've been here before. The client looks at him, confused. David sighs. This wasn't just about you. It never is. People like us walk into these rooms and they don't expect us to belong. They don't see us as equals. His client nods slowly, understanding now. David continues. I knew from the moment I stepped in there that I had two choices. I could get angry, let them control the story, or I could stay focused and force them to see the truth. His client swallows hard. And you did. David nods, and so will you. The client smiles, but there's something deeper in his expression now, determination. As David walks toward his car, his phone buzzes. A message from a colleague appears. Saw what happened today. You handled it like a pro. Proud of you. David exhales. He texts back a simple response. Thanks. More work to do. He puts his phone away and looks up at the sky. The case isn't over. The fight for respect isn't over. But today, he took a step forward.